Hi everybody, my name's Andy and I'm a design leader, startup advisor and coach. My main focus at the moment is helping companies like yours scale and mature their design function in order to deliver the maximum customer value possible. I do this because I'm a firm believer that design, in the form of an exemplary customer experience, is one of the primary markers for product success. And that highly effective design teams, if used correctly, are a major contributor to product discovery, product growth and product market fit. I'm also about to join Seedcamp for a 6-month stint as their first specialist in rotation, so please do reach out if you find this talk useful and would like to chat some more. Now, if you're in the process of scaling your business, you may have come across the greener curve, one of the main models for understanding the challenges you're likely to face as you grow and professionalise your company. In it, they talk about a number of fairly predictable crisis points which map onto the size and age of an organisation. These generally start with a crisis of leadership, then move to a crisis of autonomy, a crisis of control, a crisis of red tape, and lastly, a crisis of growth. They've recently added a 6th crisis for more sort of mature established companies, which they call the crisis of identity. Now, these are all things I've personally experienced in the companies I've run. They're also things I've witnessed in many of the companies I work with. So depending where you are in your own growth journey, you're almost certainly butting up against one of these issues, whether you're aware of it or not. One of the interesting things about each of these crises is they generally force you to stop doing the things that worked really well up to this point and probably got you to this point and force you to take an often radically different approach moving forwards. This can be especially challenging for company leaders and teams, who want to make this transition due to the sort of inevitable inertia that's involved. As a result, companies can find themselves in crises for extended periods of time, much longer than they need to be, which leads to kind of all sorts of frustrations and inefficiencies. And in my experience, teams sort of often fail because they're unable to make the changes necessary and fast enough to navigate through these sort of challenging roadblocks. Now, I could do a whole talk about these general principles of company scaling. However, the folks at Seedcamp have asked me to address some of the specific challenges they see portfolio companies facing when it comes to design. Challenges which can create turbulence, form bottlenecks, and ultimately slow growth. Now, fortunately, as with the greener curve, these challenges tend to be fairly predictable. So as founders, if you're aware of these challenges in advance, you can kind of address them before they become too much of a productivity drain. So, the first crisis I generally see take place is a crisis of value. Specifically, how much value the design team feel the founders and peers in their company have for design, for what they do. This becomes a problem because design teams are often smaller and hold less power than product or engineering, so often feel underappreciated as a result. And when teams feel underappreciated, the quality of their output and the speed of their output tends to drop. Now, while this may be the first crisis, it's also one that can easily get baked into the kind of the psyche of the company, to the point that it has long-lasting ramifications which can be really difficult to unpick. So as a little background, most of the founders that I speak to today say that they really understand and value design. Many even claim that design, in the form of customer experience, is the primary differentiator for their product. Now, this wasn't always the case, so this is actually a really positive step. And it makes sense. Over the years, the cost of development has come down so much that, aside from some specific sort of machine learning stuff, engineering provides very little maintainable and defensible competitive advantage anymore. So when competitors are able to deliver feature parity in a matter of months, if not weeks, customer experience becomes one of the few differentiators left. However, when founders say that they value design, I'm always reminded of this quote by Joe Biden. Don't tell me what you value, show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value. And this is where things start to get interesting. As many of the founders who I speak to say that they value design have actually no or very little design capabilities in their organisation. Instead, they'll get their engineers to do the design using an off-the-shelf component library. Or they do it themselves, despite having little or maybe even no background in design. If early stage founders have hired a designer, they often turn out to be fairly junior. Somebody who might be good at copying the latest styles, but struggles to solve the deeper business, product or customer experience problems that emerge in early stage startups. So who you hire and when you hire them can send a big message about how you actually value design. Now, of course, this is understandable when you're bootstrapping your company. For very early stage startups, unless you're proponent of the no-code movement, you need developers to get a product out of the door, but may feel that you can get away without initial design hires. However, the more developers you hire, the more these developers will see the problems ahead of them as tech problems and will want to hire more developers. The same is true of product people. They'll recommend hiring more product people. And this causes a bit of a cycle of prioritization and prioritizing product and engineering problems over design problems. To the point that I've seen companies that maybe are 40 or 50 strong with 10 or 20 developers where the founder is still doing design work because they're trying to avoid having to fork out for a dedicated designer. And often the result is quality issues which start to become a real roadblock to the process. As you can imagine, this also sends a really strong signal to the rest of the company that design isn't actually important. And it can often make it really sort of difficult hiring those new designers if they get the sense that, up until this point, the design has been done by people who aren't designers. So it's worth noting that the design and product decisions you make now will have a significant effect on the direction of the product. And in fact, you'll be living with the cost of these decisions for many years to come. So my advice is always to invest in the best designers possible as early as possible, as this is a point where the really critical design decisions get made. And the best way to do this is to obviously have a strong designer on the founding team. However, it's tough hiring your first designer, your first few designers really, especially if you're not part of the design community. You can't source your own candidates, it's difficult to evaluate the designer's portfolio and really set them up to thrive in this environment. So you'll end up with a bit of a chicken and egg problem and might need to seek external help. As for the crisis itself, design teams often feel undervalued in early stage startups due to the lower levels of investment they get compared with the higher levels of founder involvement than they see than other teams do. This makes it super difficult for these teams to operate at a really high level and deliver good work, which ironically makes them underperform and the founders value design even less. This becomes a really challenging cycle that results in poor team performance and really becomes super difficult to break. But let's say you do break out of this problem. You invested in design. The team has grown to maybe half a dozen people in the last 18 months and usage is really starting to pick up. The team have got into a groove, work well together and are surprisingly efficient for such a small team. However, as engineering and product have scaled, design is starting to become a bit of a bottleneck. Fortunately, you've just closed a big round of funding and are planning to double or triple the size of your design team over the next 18 months to meet this new capacity. Your founding designer has now taken on the leadership role and will be driving growth. What could possibly go wrong? Well, first off, it's worth noting that ramping up any team too quickly can cause huge problems. However, as design teams tend to lag behind engineering, they're more likely to exert a notable drag on the product, especially when being run by an inexperienced leader. As such, issues start piling up. First, your design team probably lacks the necessary processes to manage recruitment at scale, which means that they're making things up on the fly and the recruitment process feels pretty lumpy. As a result, you run the risk of really annoying candidates, causing your candidate reputation to fall, and you also run the risk of maybe hiring substandard talent just to fill the gap. You probably also lack the necessary kind of processes to manage a team at scale, because what worked for a team of 5 people won't necessarily work for a team of 15. So both your existing team members and new team members start to experience lumps and friction, which can start to cause frustrations. This problem happens so often in startups that it has a name, the new leader death spiral. Although ironically, I think it has less to do with the leader being new than the function not existing before, forcing a relatively green leader to have to create everything from scratch at the point where they know the least about leadership and don't have any pre-existing patterns or templates to fall back on. This is usually the point where design leaders reach out to someone like me for help. However, I'm not going to lie to you. This is a super difficult situation to navigate as a design leader, and a lot of leaders burn out during the growth phase, often making the decision that leadership isn't for them. Founders will typically, blame these design leaders for maybe not being up to the task, and will often reach out to more senior, more experienced leaders to kind of take their place. However, the truth is, it's really not the leader's fault, as they've effectively been set up to fail. You see, in order to properly handle this level of growth, you need to start planning 6 months in advance. You need to be building all the infrastructure to support the time-consuming recruitment process before it starts. You need to build up the management infrastructure to support a team that's going to be doubling or tripling in size. And of course, you can't do this if they're already, you and the leadership team are already maxed out with work, which is why you're recruiting in the first place. Once a team starts to scale, the life of the current design manager will change fundamentally. They'll no longer have the capacity to be an active designer. They'll no longer maybe even be able to have, be over all of the design decisions. They'll probably struggle, at least temporarily, supporting an existing team. And they, if they're trying to do both their own job and their new job, they might end up burning out. So the only way to really survive and thrive during this phase is to preemptively build out a lead, middle level management team who can start taking some of this slack. This means that if the design leader does burn out, you also have a backup in the wings. And to be honest, nothing kills a finely honed growth plan as much as losing your operational lead at this critical stage. However, you manage to navigate through this crisis of leadership and come out the other side with a stronger team. This is a point where you experience, you expect to experience a productivity ramp up. But weirdly, that doesn't happen. Instead, the design team seem to be delivering less work than before, and the designers are acting super angsty. What's going on? Well, I call this the crisis of autonomy. If you come across the competing values framework before, you'll know that organisational cultures can be divided up between stable and flexible on one axis and internal versus external on another. Smaller companies and startups tend to be highly flexible, and the teams within those startups tend to form either clan structures or adhocracies. These cultures tend to resist too much structure in favour of high levels of autonomy. However, as you grow, you inevitably need to start putting more structure in place, and when this happens, it's common to meet strong resistance. The storming phase of group development is the point at which new teams try and push back against the newly established boundaries to see what is acceptable, to exert their own agency, and to establish their identity in relationship to the group. If any of you in the audience have kids, you can see this as the organisational equivalent of the terrible twos. Storming is extremely destabilising, so it's tempting for leaders to try and placate their team by attempting to keep things how they used to be, so not putting all these structures in place. However, in all likelihood, you made these changes because the old ways weren't working or they were about to stop working. So the trick is not to hold back development, but to try and move through the storming phase as quickly as possible. Good leaders will attempt to do this by bringing the team along with them on the journey. This means making it clear what problems the team are going to experience as they scale and getting the team's help in coming up with these solutions. Because if the solutions come from the team themselves, they'll be much more likely to accept and adopt them. Now, of course, this takes a ton more effort, which is super challenging if you're already struggling with high workloads. So it's tempting for leaders to skip this step and impose what they think to be the most obvious solution. However, this can backfire in a big way, creating lots of unnecessary drama and animosity in the process. People will get frustrated by these newfound processes and perceive a reduction in autonomy, and because of this, you'll naturally lose some people as a result. You may even lose some of your core designers, the ones you are grooming for future leadership. This can feel like a really challenging time, and losing people may feel like a personal or professional failure. However, it's worth bearing in mind that this is a natural part of growth. Some folks just are naturally more suited to early stage startup life and may struggle with the transition. Although it's ironic that many people I've seen leave companies because they've grown, then go ahead and join big behemoths like Google and Facebook. I think it's the transition that's a problem more than the processes. This is also the time that product teams run the risk of becoming a feature factory. This is something that's probably been bubbling away since the start, but becomes a real problem when other areas of team autonomy are taken away. For those of you unaware what a feature factory is, it's probably worth exploring how high-functioning product teams work. A high-functioning product team tends to be self-directed. They tend to own a meaningful part of the product, are responsible for finding problems and owning outcomes. By comparison, low-functioning product teams are usually externally directed, lack any meaningful ownership, aren't involved in product discovery, and are primarily expected to deliver outputs rather than outcomes. Essentially, they become short-order chefs, shuffling tickets along a production line with little investment in what they're actually making. So, with other areas of their autonomy at risk, there's a real strong tendency for design teams to start complaining about the way product is working, how they're being treated, and the way organisations value their input, going back to the value question at the start. And this can often cause unnecessary additional tension. This is the point when design teams often start pushing for involvement in deciding what problems to solve and how to solve them. This is sometimes communicated as a need to do more research. Now, this can feel wasteful to company founders who feel they know exactly what needs to be built and just need the team to get on and deliver what they tell them to deliver, the feature factory. The only way around this problem is to move from a low-functioning to a high-functioning design team and to cede control, even if this means doing things you believe might be unnecessary or wasteful. I often liken this to maybe actors doing a rehearsal before the big night. From a purely economic perspective, this feels like a waste of time and money. Couldn't we just sort of squeeze in an extra show? But for those involved, the rehearsal is an important part of the process, much like research is to designers. It's tied not only to the process, but to their sense of identity and value. So if you take this agency away, they're going to perform worse, even if you think, well, we can save a bit of time and cut some corners here and there. Now, up to this point, the designers have been probably thinking of themselves as an individual team. However, as you grow, cross-functional collaboration invariably starts to break down. To help fix this, companies will often switch to a matrix-like structure where they embed with their cross-functional partners. This is the point where I see teams typically experimenting with the Spotify model or product trifectas. The idea that rather than having a single PM lead a team, the team is led by a mixture of a designer, a developer, and a product manager. Designers usually feel really comfortable in the old agency setup, as they're surrounded by folks who get them. However, put them in a cross-functional team and they can start to feel really outnumbered, undervalued and lonely. Designers will often push back at these moves because it threatens their sense of identity and cohesion. And this can create a real us and them type relationship, which is understandable but really challenging and can be quite difficult to manage. Reflecting on his time leading design at Lyft, Frank Yu talked about how the company tried to create this sort of design-led culture to set up an amazing central design studio that only designers were allowed to have access to. I think they wanted to create a sort of an Apple and Airbnb of the ride-sharing world. And it worked to some extent. The designers were having a wonderful time. They had this brilliant culture that was optimized towards the designers. The problem is, the rest of the company hated them as a result. They received a ton of pushback from their cross-functional peers. Some of it was just pretty brutal. And the relationship sort of became, between engineers and product people and designers, sort of found itself at an all-time low. The solution, as you'd expect by now, was to move to sort of cross-functional embedded product teams. However, this was a super tough change because the designers were onto a good thing. So, in order to do this, the designers sort of, when they moved into these teams, they felt that their autonomy had been taken away, their status and identity had been removed. So the way around this is to make sure that you balance the other areas of their job by making sure that these high-functioning product teams exist and allow the designers within these product teams to gain a sense of mastery, autonomy and purpose. 3 things we know that really lead to high levels of workplace engagement and satisfaction. However, this takes strong cross-functional leadership and a willingness for design, product and engineering to work together to form a first team mentality rather than focusing on the individual sort of functional teams they look after. However, as designers move outside of the control of the design leaders, those leaders need to also switch their direction and focus from being sort of direction and pace setting leaders to being kind of coaches and servant leaders. Because you can't control all of your designers when they're embedded in teams and making decisions as a group. So this typically means switching from a command and control style of leadership into a more kind of team-centric kind of community-focused approach, where you're trying to kind of offset the lack of cohesiveness that you've lost from moving from a single team to multiple teams, with an internal focus on community, both internal community actually and global design community. So this is when design leaders start to tend to focus on, building internal community activity in order to supplement these sort of broken bonds. You start to see more internal brown bags, conferences and events, publishing, newsletters, email kind of, outreach, creating kind of design languages and culture sort of documents, mentoring programs, etc. This is also where you start to see design ops sort of step in. You'll usually see teams start to experiment with design ops when they hit about 20 to 30 people. And you can usually expect to see a whole design ops team, if the design team hits 100 or more, to help pick up some of the slack, to focus on the culture, to focus on the operational elements. Okay, so you've got a series of high functioning product teams. The designers are happy and everyone's getting on great. Sounds amazing, huh? Well, there's one final hurdle that happens to teams in the performing phase of forming, storming, norming and performing. And that's around alignment. In large organisations, you'll often find separate teams trying to solve similar problems, often unbeknownst to each other. You'll find other teams pulling in opposite directions, especially if they have the high degree of autonomy and own the outcomes you'd expect from a high-functioning team. As a result, product cohesiveness really starts to suffer. And things like customer satisfaction metrics start to sort of stall as a result. When this happens, it's tempting for the top team to blame the designers for this drop in quality, and it's tempting for the designers to blame the leadership team for a lack of vision. So how do you avoid teams falling over each other and wasting a ton of effort? Well, at this level, the role of the leadership team is primarily one of setting and maintaining alignment. This is because you can't really expect your design leaders to be all over every decision. And if they were all over every decision, they'd be stripping autonomy from their teams. So how do you make sure everyone's pulling in the right direction if you can't direct them? Well, essentially leadership at scale becomes a culture and communication problem. It's about setting the strategy and repeating it over and over again until folks become bored and you're blue in the face. It's about having design principles and team mandates that directly feed into your product strategy. It's about having and setting expectations through performance reviews and tools like OKRs. And a lot of it is about putting out fires, which are almost always alignment problems between individual stakeholders or teams. This requires strong management skills and the ability to have often really challenging conversations in a safe and respectful way, which in turn requires leadership to give up control and adopt a more coaching style. And the frustrating thing is that this work is never done. As you scale, you're unlikely to hit any other major new crises in your team, because the crises are divided and subdivided into smaller, almost constant problems. Like a game of organisational whack-a-mole, fixing one problem will invariably create several more, and the cycle continues. So to recap, I see 5 common challenges that keep repeating themselves inside design teams as they and the companies they serve scale. These issues lead to a lot of unnecessary drama and tension, both inside the design teams and with their cross-functional peers. This usually results in a drop of efficiency, quality and delivery speed, as well as staff satisfaction, which can lead to challenging comments on Glassdoor, difficulty with retention and difficulty recruiting. While these issues can usually be navigated through in as little as 6 months, many teams get stuck in this sort of drama for years, and things become even more problematic when these issues don't get addressed and start to compound. So, my advice to founders is to be aware of these issues in advance, to see them as symptomatic problems rather than individual performance problems, and to realise that they are things that you can't necessarily hire your way out of, but actually require fundamental changes in behaviour, not just within the design team, but across the whole of your org. My advice is to get expert help where possible. This could be from investors, from consultants, and from coaches like myself. And to realise that the role that you play in these dysfunctions can be equally important. Because one of the things I've learned as a company MD is, at the end of the day, while I may not be directly responsible for all the issues in my company, my assumptions and behaviours cast a surprisingly long shadow, and changes won't be possible unless you're seen to understand and value these systemic problems and the systemic problems your team are facing, and are willing to roll up your sleeves and take an active part in fixing them. Thank you very much. If you've got any questions, please do reach out. I'm just Andy Budd on Twitter. And yeah, I'd love to speak to you about how I can help you and your team really, really scale design in your organisation.